Hello, my friends. This is Dr. Beter. Today is July 30, 1980, and this is my AUDIO LETTER number 56. Yesterday an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly came to an end. It was treated as a non-event by the controlled major media of the United States, and many Americans have paid little attention. But it was only the 7th emergency session in the 35-year history of the United Nations. My friends, the stakes involve Nuclear War I. The Bolsheviks who now control the United States government are determined to bring about nuclear war with Russia one way or another. But their most preferred path to war lies through the Middle East. I first gave details about this nearly 5 years ago in AUDIO LETTER number 6. Since then, there have been continual revisions and updates of the planning for war by way of the Middle East. I've kept my listeners abreast of these developments in later AUDIO letters, especially numbers 22, 28, 37, and 46. Ever since late 1977, the Middle East war plan has grown to include Iran as a central factor, because the main military strategy of the controlled United States government is now a first-strike strategy, and Iran, nestled against Russia's underbelly, is a tempting base for attack against Russia. But the preferred initial focus of a Middle East war would not be Iran, but Israel. In AUDIO LETTER 50, I reviewed the common roots of the Zionists who control Israel and the Bolsheviks who now control America. They always work together, hand in glove, because they are derived from the same source. That ancient source was the misnamed Kingdom of the Jews, the Khazar Kingdom, which existed 1,000 years ago in what is now southern Russia. The Bolsheviks and Zionists are identical in their goals and tactics, except for one thing. The Zionist dream is for eventual world domination from Jerusalem, whereas the Bolsheviks want to control their former homeland of Russia and rule the world from there. But the Bolsheviks have largely lost the power they gained in Russia in 1917, and they are now using the United States as their main power base. The Bolshevik-controlled United States is virtually the lone sponsor of Israel. In return, Israel performs many favors for America's rulers, especially in military and covert spy matters. The United Nations emergency session, which just ended, amounted to a referendum by the world against Israel. For years, the Begin government of Israel has been pressing ahead in a relentless program of acts designed to inflame the anger of Israel's Arab neighbors. While protesting loudly that she only wants to be left alone in peace, Israel has been systematically doing the things that can only lead to war. And it is a war which can very quickly engulf the entire world. That is why a majority of the members of the United Nations were worried enough to petition for an emergency session. And after the 6-day debate was over, 112 nations lined up together against Israel. They declared Israel's settlements in the occupied Arab territories illegal and demanded that Israel start pouring out before November 15 of this year. Their common position was summed up by Guinea's United Nations ambassador in the words, "The process of war must come to an end." Israel's ambassador at the United Nations tried to paint the whole debate as a meaningless gesture, even though the United Nations created Israel in the first place. And following the Zionist lead, the Bolshevik-dominated major media here in America treated it as a non-event. The fact is, my friends, that Israeli actions are fast bringing the Middle East to the threshold of war. War fever is rising, and it is being reflected by the thermometer of war, the price of gold. Last January 21, 1980, gold traded at an all-time high of $875 per ounce. And as I revealed that month in AUDIO LETTER 53, A secret nuclear first strike operation was then being attempted against Russia. It failed, and gold prices dropped off for several months. But now, war danger is rising again. The Bolsheviks here are becoming increasingly desperate in their war plans against Russia. If we as a people are ever going to act to save ourselves from final ruin, now is the time we must begin. The stakes are life and death, peace or war. But the key to our own effective action is not military. It lies with the thermometer of war, gold. My three special topics this month are: topic number 1, Ian Fleming and the Fort Knox gold scandal. Topic number 2, narrowing options in the Bolshevik plan for nuclear war. And topic number 3, step 1 in what you can do. Topic number 1. Not many years ago, millions were fascinated by the fictional exploits of an imaginary British spy. His name was James Bond, and he was the creation of the late British author Ian Fleming. It was Fleming more than anyone else who created the image of the modern super spy. All the Fleming spy stories had two major characteristics in common that made them stand out. For one thing, every story was about a world-shaking situation which was kept secret from the public. The other common ingredient was always a dazzling display of secret high technologies of every description, things unknown to the public. These two unique features of his stories eventually catapulted Ian Fleming into worldwide fame. He was the undisputed leader in his field. As always happens, many others tried to copy him, and spy stories were all around us in the late 60s. But he always remained one of a kind. Try as they might, none of his imitators could ever match his work. It was as though he had a secret advantage, a secret weapon of his own. And my friends, he did. In writing his stories, Ian Fleming was drawing upon his own secret weapon. That weapon was knowledge. Fleming had been a high-ranking officer of Britain's crack intelligence agency called MI5. It was the British who practically invented and perfected the modern concept of intelligence. And to this day, British intelligence remains the equal of any in the world. When Fleming left Her Majesty's Secret Service to become a writer, he was severely limited in what he could publish. He was bound by the restrictions of the British Official Secrets Act. Under that act, Fleming would have been liable for punishment for revealing any official secret without authorization. And so, Ian Fleming, the former British intelligence officer, became what is known as a fictionalizer. That is, he started with factual knowledge but rearranged and modified it in order to create startling stories of fiction. He was always extremely careful about how he did this. He always knew that he was skirting the fringes of the Official Secrets Act. He could not afford to make a mistake because it would have meant prison for him and possible forfeiture of pension rights. And so he always altered every situation, every secret technology, and every personality enough to avoid revealing actual secrets. It was a long and meticulous process both to protect himself and to make each final story readable. For that reason, Fleming completed a new James Bond novel only about once a year. If it had all been imagination, as many people believe, he would have been capable of producing a new book every few months, making himself far richer. But because his stories were all rooted in fact, secret fact, he did not dare speed up and run the risk of making a mistake. Ian Fleming had two purposes in writing his famous series of spy novels. One purpose, of course, was to earn a very comfortable living. But beyond that, he was also trying to subtly open the eyes of the reading public by the medium of fiction. Because of the Official Secrets Act, he could not publish the facts that he knew as fact, without modification. So he did what he felt was the next best thing. and that was to use his stories to open our minds to at least think in terms which were otherwise hidden from us. Fleming truly believed that this was something which somehow had to be done, because knowing what he knew, he was not an optimistic man. More than 3 decades ago, he could see that the public was beginning to be left behind by secret new weapons, new technologies, and new techniques to enslave us all. A public awakening was the only hope he could see to prevent eventual disaster. And so, beginning in the early 50s, Fleming started writing exciting fiction in order to hint at secret facts. His plan was fictionalized to open eyes. By the early 60s, the one-man campaign of Ian Fleming was starting to gather steam. His fictional hero, James Bond, started gaining popularity in ever wider circles. And even though his exploits were understood to be fiction, people were beginning to think of possibilities which they had never seen before. James Bond movies were in the works. After years of gradual growth, the power of Ian Fleming's fiction was about to explode into a worldwide craze. Countless millions were on the verge of being encouraged to think unthinkable thoughts about what goes on in secret. Simply by encouraging people to think new thoughts for themselves, Ian Fleming was endangering secret plans of very powerful men. And he almost got away with it, because they were slow to realize what he was doing. But just as the James Bond craze was beginning, Ian Fleming's plan was brought to an end. 16 years ago next month, on August 12, 1964, Ian Fleming died an untimely death at age 56. By making us think, Ian Fleming had posed a real danger to secret long-range plans of a powerful few. And even after he was removed from the scene, his fictional efforts to awaken us could not be stopped overnight. The momentum of public interest was just too great, because he had caught the imagination of millions upon millions. The James Bond craze could not be stopped, and so the other choice was to control it. Experts in propaganda and public deception studied the problem and quickly hit on the solution. Fleming's plan had been fictionalized to open eyes. He wanted to make us see possibilities which were being hidden from us otherwise. But with him out of the way, the new plan became fictionalized to close eyes. It was a plan to make secrets more secure than ever by making the truth unbelievable to us. And this technique of blinding us through fiction has been a major factor on the American scene now for 15 years. A perfect example of all of this took place with a book Fleming published 21 years ago in 1959. It was titled Goldfinger. The starting point for the book was knowledge about certain secrets. Fleming knew that there was a long-range plan to create monetary chaos for private gain and power. He also knew that a central feature of the plan was to be the secret disappearance of America's monetary gold hoard at Fort Knox. And he knew that the kingpin of this international plot was a man with legendary greed for gold. His name, David Rockefeller. It was a plan that was totally unsuspected by the public. It was still the Eisenhower era, the heyday of the so-called almighty dollar. The dollar was good as gold because it was backed by the world's largest monetary gold hoard. Fort Knox was thought to be impregnable. And in those days, my friends, no one dared speak ill of the four Rockefeller brothers. Ian Fleming decided to write a book that would begin to alert people to what was afoot. He could not tell the whole story, nor tell it as fact, because of the Official Secrets Act. But by fictionalizing, he was able to cause people to think of possibilities which would never have occurred to them otherwise. For example, in the 50s, it was a rare American who considered even the possibility of monetary turmoil. The dollar was good as gold, and that was that. Why even think about gold? Individual citizens could not own it except in jewelry. Wasn't all the rest of it thought to be sealed up in Fort Knox? Everyone knew no one could get in there, and so we didn't even think about it. But in his book Goldfinger, Fleming brought several key thoughts to our minds. He devised a fictional scheme to show that Fort Knox might not be impregnable after all. He raised the question, what would happen to the dollar and other currencies if the Fort Knox gold were no longer available? And he proposed the unthinkable thought that someone, if they were rich enough and greedy enough, might want to get their hands on America's gold. The actual Goldfinger story, of course, was fiction, but the basic points which I have just mentioned were fact. Goldfinger was published in 1959, and barely 2 years later, in 1961, the hemorrhaging of America's monetary gold supply began. Agents of David Rockefeller within the United States government provided a cloak of authority called the London Gold Pool Agreement, and then for 7 years, until 1968, big Army trucks loaded with gold bullion rolled out of Fort Knox constantly, and all without a word to the public. Some of the gold shipments during those 7 years were recorded on a list kept by the United States Mint. Almost without exception, the shipments listed went to the New York Assay Office, where they disappeared without any further accounting. As you may recall, the New York Assay Office was the focus of a scandal in December 1978 involving missing gold. Over 5,000 ounces had simply disappeared. But that, my friends, was a very small tip of a very large iceberg. And so the controversy over the missing millions in gold at the New York Assay Office was quickly smoothed over and covered up. They could not afford to allow any real investigation which might let the public know the truth. According to the official list of shipments I mentioned earlier, a large fraction of America's monetary gold went to the New York Assay Office in the 60s. There it disappeared, never to be seen again. But, my friends, the real situation was even worse. Long ago my sources gave me hard evidence of many large gold shipments from Fort Knox which were not even listed. 5 years ago this month, in audio letter number 2, I revealed a specific example of this. It was a shipment on January 20, 1965, in which 4 tractor-trailers loaded up at Fort Knox and then headed for railroad tracks across the river at Jeffersonville, Indiana. My sources provided me with details, including photographs of the operation, but the shipment was one of many which did not show on any official government list of shipments. In June 1975, Mr. Edward Durrell and my other associates were able to confront officials of the United States Mint with this example of missing shipments. And for once, the confrontation took place under circumstances in which the Mint was under great pressure to respond. In the most specific terms, the Bureau of the Mint was asked what was shipped out of Fort Knox in the 4 tractor-trailers on January 20, 1965. The written answer, dated June 19, 1975, came from the then Director of the United States Mint, Mrs. Mary Brooks. She confirmed that this unlisted shipment amounted to more than 1 3/4 million ounces of gold. And, my friends, it was not junk gold melted down from old coins which were confiscated from Americans in 1934. The shipment was part of America's true monetary gold, good delivery gold, which is .995 fine or better. After this admission in writing about an enormous secret shipment of gold out of Fort Knox, one would have thought that there would be fireworks, but not so. My friend Mr. Durrell showered the appropriate officials throughout the government with this evidence of massive fraud at Fort Knox. And he notified the major media and all the appropriate leaders in Congress about this evidence. For reasons which I will explain later in this message, I believe it's time to call attention to one of these people. He is Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. Proxmire loves to parade as a great defender of our financial interests in Washington. He's famous for his so-called Golden Fleece Award. Proxmire searches through the federal budget with a fine-tooth comb, and he's always able to find some project or contract which, rightly or wrongly, will look ridiculous to the public. He then trots it out, announces how much it costs, and with a great flourish gives it his Golden Fleece Award. By this and other means, Proxmire is a master at maintaining his image as a protector of the American economy. But if ever a situation deserved the Proxmire Golden Fleece Award, it is the Fort Knox gold scandal. The petty examples usually chosen by Proxmire fleece the American public out of perhaps hundreds of thousands or a few $1,000,000. It makes good publicity for Proxmire, but it's insignificant. By contrast, the Fort Knox gold scandal is fleecing every one of us out of the shirt on our back. It has undermined the dollar itself, which is on its way to destruction. It has set off ever-worsening inflation, even while our economy is stagnating. The gold scandal is fleecing us all, but what has Senator William Proxmire done about that? Let me tell you what he has and has not done. For more than 5 years, Proxmire has been among the top American leaders who have been kept informed about major developments and evidence in the gold scandal. He has been given the evidence I mentioned earlier about the missing shipment from Fort Knox, as well as other evidence of major discrepancies. But up to now, Proxmire has kept his lips sealed about discrepancies about America's gold supply, with one exception. That exception took place in December 1978. Word had leaked out about the 5,000 or so missing ounces of gold at the New York Assay Office, worth over $3 million at today's prices. As chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, Proxmire immediately jumped on the story. Frowning in disapproval, he proclaimed that this would have to be looked into. Hearing those words from the champion of the Golden Fleece Award, the public relaxed and quickly forgot about it. And almost as quickly, Senator William Proxmire made sure he forgot about it too. To this day, no real investigation has ever taken place over the missing gold at the New York Assay Office. Proxmire's failure to follow up that $3 million gold discrepancy was bad enough, but it's nothing compared to his apparent disinterest in investigating the truth about the Fort Knox gold scandal. The case of the missing Fort Knox shipment is a case in point. At today's prices, that one shipment alone was worth more than $1 billion. Not a mere million, but 1,000 times a million. And that, in truth, was only one example. There were many unreported shipments like that. That is why the Treasury figures, which show a huge remaining American gold hoard, are a fraud, a total fraud. And that's why the United States could auction off only a small amount of junk gold over a period of time, and that had to stop. And that's why the United States dollar is no longer as good as gold. Instead, it's fast becoming worth less than the paper it's printed on. Senator William Proxmire, like many others trusted by the American public, has been given massive evidence about all of this. But his actions so far have helped only those who have taken our own gold in order to fleece us of everything we own. Later in this message, I will have more to say about Senator William Proxmire and the Fort Knox gold scandal. But for now, I want to finish the story of Ian Fleming's aborted efforts to alert the public about things like these. As I already explained, his principle was fictionalized to open eyes, but after his untimely death in 1964, his stories were seized upon and warped, especially in movies, for the opposite purpose. The new purpose became fictionalized to close eyes. Nothing could be done to alter and neutralize Fleming's books once they had been published, so instead attention was drawn away from the books to the James Bond movies, and as the movies were in preparation, disinformation agents were planted on the scene to guide the process. As a result, the James Bond who emerged on film was a very different character from the one in Fleming's novels. The basic storylines remained the same, but in many subtle ways the psychology was radically changed. The movies retained the adventure, fast action, dazzling secret technologies, and bold plots which Fleming had pioneered, but by clever use of satirical humor, every James Bond movie ended up by laughing at itself. Secret weapons were exaggerated or twisted so as to make them entertaining but also ridiculous. And by filling the movies with strange characters and never-ending gimmicks, viewers were distracted from the underlying warnings of the basic plot. The Goldfinger story was a perfect example of all this. Fleming's original novel called attention to something which most readers would never have thought about otherwise. That was the potential relationship between Fort Knox gold and international monetary chaos. And through his fictional plot, he also planted the idea that the legendary Fort Knox bullion depository might not be invulnerable after all. But these lessons were rarely, if ever, realized by those who saw only the movie. Instead, the typical viewer walked out of the movie laughing. It was obvious that what he had seen could happen only in fiction, and from that point onward he was programmed to react with disbelief if he should ever hear of tampering with Fort Knox gold. Such a thing could only be fiction. It was just too ridiculous ever to really happen. This is the attitude I encountered more than 7 years ago when I began giving public warnings about deliberate plans for economic chaos. I myself was first alerted to the Fort Knox gold scandal by none other than British intelligence in London after completing a secret mission for Queen Elizabeth in Zaire. And in my book, The Conspiracy Against the Dollar, I outlined the overall plan, including the unseen role of America's gold. I had one major advantage which Ian Fleming did not have. The United States does not yet have an official Secrets Act like that of Britain, and so I was not forced to fictionalize. Instead, I was able to give the real plans and real names of those responsible for things to come. The prototype for Ian Fleming's Goldfinger of 2 decades ago was none other than David Rockefeller. And in my book I showed in detail how he played his kingpin role in the plan to destroy our economy. I described how this was leading to a collapsing dollar, skyrocketing gold prices, a stagnating economy, spiraling financial problems for state and local governments, urban unrest, and eventually nuclear war. But when David Rockefeller himself was interviewed about my book, even he resorted to the technique fictionalized to close eyes. His comment about the conspiracy against the dollar was, "Interesting science fiction." But my friends, the truth is always stranger than fiction. Today it is fiction that we believe and fact that we don't believe. Most people still believe the fiction that David Rockefeller himself is still alive, but he actually died in a secret coup d'etat nearly a year and a half ago, as I revealed in AUDIO LETTER 43. What we see today is no longer David Rockefeller, but only his image. My friends, the truth is the truth, no matter what we choose to believe. And what the late David Rockefeller dismissed as interesting science fiction 7 years ago is coming true today. Yesterday we would not believe. Today we are suffering. Tomorrow it will be too late if we do not act now.
This is the end of Side 1. Please advance the tape to the end and turn the cassette over to continue.
Topic number 2. For more than 2 years now, the United States government, under the Bolsheviks, has been dragging Americans down the path toward national suicide in nuclear war. America's controlling military strategy today is a kamikaze plan which I first revealed in AUDIO LETTER 35 for June 1978. If there should be all-out war between the United States and Russia, the United States will be at a hopeless military disadvantage. The Russians completely destroyed the rough military balance between East and West during the closing months of 1977. During those months, as I reported in AUDIO letters 26 through 29, the Russians deployed their new secret space triad of manned strategic weapons, and since that time the Russians have had men in space constantly on a routine basis. Meanwhile, the United States can do nothing but sit and watch. Our famous Space Shuttle, already 2 years behind schedule, just keeps sitting on the ground instead of flying into space. And the biggest American space spectacular in the past 3 years was the alleged crash of Skylab 1 year ago this month. But as I detailed in AUDIO LETTER 48, even that episode was a hoax. Skylab had actually been shot down 21 months earlier, as I reported in AUDIO LETTER 27. For more than 2 years we have been at Russia's mercy militarily. If the Kremlin were the real source of nuclear war fever today, the United States would already lie in smoking ruins. But it hasn't happened. And the reason it hasn't happened is something I've been reporting to you now for 2.5 years. Those who formerly controlled the Kremlin, the atheistic Bolsheviks, control it no more. They have been overthrown and expelled by a secret sect of native Russian Christians. The expelled Bolsheviks from Russia have been flocking in droves mainly here, to the United States, for a new start. And so unsuspected by most Americans, the true relationship between the United States and Russia has been turned upside down. The Bolsheviks who used to rule Russia now rule the United States. And now that they are here, they are still as vicious and warlike as they ever were in Russia. If America were ruled today by reasonable and honest men, concerned for the welfare of all the people, they would take an objective look at our relations with Russia. On one hand, they would see the military fact that Russia now has the means to level our country a dozen times over in a matter of minutes. But on the other hand, reasonable men would also take stock of the fact that Russia has not unleashed that awesome capability. Instead, the Russians have so far confined themselves to a piecemeal war of attrition against our own war-making capacity. Looking at all this, reasonable men would at least consider the possibility that Russia prefers peace to war. And so our leaders, if they were reasonable and prudent, would at least open up meaningful talks with the leaders of Russia. They would at least make an honest effort to find out if war with Russia might be avoided without loss of honor. But, my friends, the Bolsheviks are now in control of America's policies, and they are not reasonable men. They are obsessed with a satanic frenzy for power. Their creed is rule or ruin. They seek only their own personal gain, no matter what the cost may be to everyone else. They want to start over with a new and complete Bolshevik dictatorship here in America, and from there work on outward in a new bid for world control. But Russia, controlled by the new breed in the Kremlin, stands in their way. The Bolsheviks now entrenched here in America know that they cannot hope to destroy Russia with America's inferior military power. This is especially true because Russia's rulers, unlike our own, have provided extensive civil defense preparations to protect their people. but the Bolsheviks will be satisfied if they can only wound Russia grievously enough to badly disrupt Russia internally. The Bolsheviks here believe that they will accomplish their purpose if they can kill as many as 20 million Russians in nuclear war. They are convinced that nuclear casualties that large will be enough to preoccupy the Russians with their own internal problems for many years, and that will leave the Bolsheviks here relatively free to make a fresh start with the smoking remains of the United States. They will be free to impose their own Bolshevik dictatorship on the haunted minority of Americans who will survive Nuclear War I. In order to achieve their goal of killing 20 million Russians, the Bolsheviks here will have to accept a nuclear war that will kill at least 160 million Americans. To you and me, a plan like that is insane. But to the Bolsheviks, those odds are very acceptable. Because, my friends, in Bolshevik calculations, you and I don't count. We are expendable. The only losses which do matter to them are their own, and the Bolsheviks believe that their own casualties in Nuclear War I will be very small, because they plan to choose the moment for war themselves by triggering a surprise American nuclear first strike against Russia. And because they will know when war is about to start, they will be able to protect themselves. They plan to use their positions of governmental power to hide in government war bunkers throughout the United States. When Nuclear War I erupts, the Bolsheviks here intend to be the main occupants of the 96 secret underground cities of the Federal Relocation Arc. They will pull down the temple on our heads while they themselves hide in safety. There is now a dangerous and destructive war of cat and mouse going on between Russia's new rulers and the Bolsheviks here. Each side knows what the other is up to, and their strategies against one another are in a constant state of flux. The Russians, for their part, know that the Bolsheviks want to throw America's nuclear might at Russia in a surprise attack, and as I reported in AUDIO LETTER 53 last January, the hardliners in the Kremlin are now in the driver's seat. Unlike the White Dove faction who lost influence last October 1979, the hardliners are convinced that nuclear war is inevitable, and so they are preparing the Russian people for war with America. But at the same time, they're using secret warfare to chip away and reduce America's economic and military strength. For example, Russian sabotage is taking a steadily rising toll of railroad tank cars, chemical plants, refineries, and other military targets. Have you ever asked yourself why all these so-called derailments involve chemical tank cars? If it were mere chance, it would often involve boxcars, or coal cars, or flat cars, or automobile carriers, or maybe refrigerated cars full of milk. But no, to judge by all the supposed rail accidents, you would think that the trains are hauling nothing but toxic chemicals these days. And then there is Russia's expanding campaign of geophysical warfare. One aspect of this involves earthquakes and volcanoes like Mount St. Helens, as I discussed last month. Another aspect of geophysical warfare is weather warfare, which is now going on with a vengeance in the United States. One reason I tried so hard to record AUDIO LETTER 54 last February, before I was overcome by my heart attack, was to give a warning about weather warfare and food shortages to come. And this summer, the weather has gone crazy all over the United States. The northern plains are in the grip of a drought worse than anything since the Dust Bowl of the 30s. The nationwide heat wave has taken over 1,000 lives and is killing cattle, broiling chickens alive, and wiping out crops. And next, my friends, we must brace ourselves for hurricanes unlike anything ever seen in America. Slowly but surely, the Bolsheviks here are being hemmed in by the Russians. For the past 6 months, the Russians have been gradually pulling the fangs of the Bolshevik dragon. As a result, The Bolsheviks here are gradually putting more and more of their eggs into fewer and fewer baskets. With their backs to the wall, the Bolsheviks here are concentrating on actions that go for the head of Russia. Their attitude is pure offense, even at the expense of neglecting anything of a defensive nature. For example, the Caribbean is now up for grabs. The United States is paying no attention. Instead, the Bolsheviks here are trying to stir up problems for Russia around her own periphery. The Bolsheviks can't find a rope big enough to tie down the Russian bear, so instead they're trying to use a million little threads. And by means of their invasion of the Kremlin itself with genetic replicas, which I reported last month, the Bolsheviks are trying to unbalance the Kremlin. I can now report that during April and May the Bolsheviks came very close to toppling the new leadership in the Kremlin. Within the past several weeks, Russia's new rulers have staged a strong comeback, but the battle is still raging, and all the Bolsheviks really want is a moment of weakness in the Kremlin, because very soon now they will have enough Minuteman TX traveling missiles deployed to make possible a first strike against Russia, thus triggering Nuclear War I. My friends, some people have asked me why I revealed what I did last month about America's secret mobile missile, the Minuteman TX. The answer is that it is time for us, the American people, to wage preventive warfare. Ours must be a war of knowledge and truth, a war to prevent war. We need to stop the secret spiral of warfare by both the Russians and the Bolsheviks here, because you and I are the ones who are caught in the middle. Topic number 3. Centuries ago, the founder of the powerful Rothschild dynasty proclaimed a principle which became famous. He said, "Give me the power to issue a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." Since that time, the manipulation of money and its relationship to gold reserves has been a determining factor in world affairs. It has fueled ever-widening struggles for world power. That's why Henry Ford Sr. long ago said, and I quote, "War will not be abolished until its roots are cut, and one of its main roots is a false money system and the high priests thereof. The youth who can solve the money question will do more for the world than all the professional soldiers in history." Unquote. My friends, in my book 7 years ago, The Conspiracy Against the Dollar, I revealed the basic plan to bring on inflation miseries, which we are all beginning to suffer today. They are leading toward economic catastrophe, unemployment, dictatorship, and nuclear war. But they are all rooted in economics and the control of money. And the deepest root of all is the Fort Knox gold scandal. So if you truly care about your country and want to help save it for yourself and for your children, the Fort Knox gold scandal is the place to begin. In my mail lately, I have noticed a dramatic rise in the number of people asking me, "What can I do?" And I believe that I know the reason. Years ago, the warnings I gave about coming economic hardship and nuclear war sounded too remote to worry about. But now the economic problems are pinching all of us worse and worse by the day, and now the bright skies of yesteryear are giving way to the gathering storm clouds of nuclear war. Up until now, I have generally resisted giving specific answers to the question of what we can do. There were many signs that people were asking without really wanting to do anything, and it simply is not enough to just stand up once, shout, and sit down again to watch the world go by, or to meet, eat, and retreat. If you are really serious about wanting to do something, you have to be willing to stick with it, because America's enemies, both within and without, have learned how they can almost always defeat us. All they have to do is to close their mouths and wait. They just bide their time while we fuss a while, then fall silent and forget about it. Then they go on their own way as if nothing had ever happened. The only way to get results is to hang on like a bulldog. You have to keep at it in spite of one disappointment after another until something breaks loose. You cannot let them wear you out. Instead, you have to wear them out. A perfect example of this is provided by the efforts of my friend Mr. Edward Durrell concerning the Fort Knox gold scandal. 6 years ago, Mr. Durrell started in much the same way as you could start now. He first learned about my charges concerning the denudement of America's gold at Fort Knox by reading about them in a newspaper. He had been concerned about the gold backing of the dollar for many years, but my charges were new to him. He decided to find out for himself whether my charges held water. So he began a very informal, almost casual way. He inquired of one or two officials, including his congressman, whether there was anything to the story. And it was their responses that caused him to start digging deeper and still deeper, seeking the truth. Not because those initial responses confirmed what I had charged. Far from it. Instead, Mr. Durrell discovered that he was unable to receive a meaningful, conclusive answer at all about it. Most Americans today would have just given up at that point. The easy thing to do is to shrug your shoulders and say, "Well, I tried. I guess they won't tell me any more." But not Mr. Durrell. He's a man who demands answers, and he refuses to be satisfied until he gets them. What's more, he knows what too many of us have forgotten, that under the Constitution it is our right, it is our duty to seek the redress of grievances. And so for every unsatisfactory answer he received, Mr. Durrell responded by asking more questions of more people. He kept careful track of his correspondence, including telephone calls, letters, telegrams, and personal meetings. He did not just swallow the replies he got, but he analyzed them. With each official reply he asked himself, did this answer my question? If not, why not? Did they contradict what they have told me in earlier correspondence? If so, why? Does the story I get from official A agree with the story given me by official B? If not, which is correct? By confronting people with their own official answers or with their silence when they refused to answer, he began driving chinks into the armor. And because of his determined persistence, he long ago began catching them in mistakes, serious mistakes. For 6 years now he has kept it up, and now through his own efforts Mr. Durrell has compiled his own file of extremely damaging evidence about Fort Knox. By these methods Mr. Durrell long ago became an authority in his own right about the Fort Knox gold scandal, and he did it simply by refusing to give up. He has contacted numerous members of Congress, officials of the Departments of Treasury and Justice, and many others, up to and including 2 presidents, Ford and the alleged Carter. For his efforts he has received everything from stony silence to outright provable lies. He has worked long and hard for 6 years, and now if there were an honest public investigation into the Fort Knox affair, his files might well lead to the imprisonment of some of the most powerful men in America. The Watergate scandal was child's play compared with the covered-up Fort Knox gold scandal. This brings me to the reason for my directing your attention to Senator William Proxmire, as I did in topic number 1. He's chairman of the powerful Senate Banking Committee, and in that capacity he holds a position of prime responsibility and public trust to carry out an honest, thorough, and public investigation of the Fort Knox gold scandal. And so, my friends, I would strongly suggest that the starting point be the evidence about the huge missing shipment of gold from Fort Knox on January 20, 1965. For 5 years now, Senator Proxmire has ignored the evidence given him about that shipment, which was omitted from official Treasury records. At today's gold prices, the shipment would have been worth more than $1 billion, $1,000 million. But more importantly, that missing shipment was only one of many which took place from Fort Knox according to my confidential information. It was only one episode in the overall program to make America gold poor. And so the missing gold shipment of January 20, 1965 points at the very heart of the causes for our crumbling economy today. But to this day, Senator William Proxmire has not lifted a finger to launch a Fort Knox investigation. I want to make it clear, however, that I have no evidence that Proxmire himself is involved in the illegal gold removals from Fort Knox, but I can prove that he has consistently ignored large amounts of strong evidence of catastrophic fraud surrounding Fort Knox. He's made a name for himself by handing out Golden Fleece Awards for petty matters, but he has ignored the gold scandal, which is fleecing the entire American people. Up to now, Senator Proxmire has been seriously derelict in his duty to investigate publicly and honestly the Fort Knox gold scandal. But what matters most now is not Proxmire, but the scandal itself. It must be exposed if America is to be saved. It's that simple, my friends. And so I'm about to give you step one in my answer to those of you who have been asking me, what can I do? I emphasize that this is only the first step. If you choose to take it, my friends, then many more steps can follow. But I must also give you this clear warning. If you will not take this first step, nothing else can follow. In the name of freedom, we must be heard. We must begin a concerted campaign to open up an honest public investigation of the Fort Knox gold scandal, and we should all join together in directing our energies at Senator William Proxmire. It is his committee which has the prime responsibility to carry out the necessary public investigation. Our goal is not to attack Proxmire, but to bring about the investigation of Fort Knox. To do that, Proxmire will have to have public support, just as General Brown depended upon public support in the underwater missile crisis 4 years ago. And so, regardless of its inaction up to now, we must let Senator Proxmire know that he will have our support for a Fort Knox investigation. It is not his head that we want, it is the truth about Fort Knox. Let us open up Fort Knox. You may send letters, mailgrams, or telegrams to Senator William Proxmire, Proxmire, Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. If you want your message to be read and to have an impact, you must do three things. First, make it legible. If your handwriting is good, a handwritten letter is fine. Otherwise, it's better to type. Second, keep it short. If you write a long, rambling letter, it will just go into the trash basket. Third, be specific. Tell Senator Proxmire clearly in your own words what you want from him. If I were writing a letter to Senator Proxmire about this, I would say something like the following. Dear Senator Proxmire, I'm writing to request your urgent attention to a vital matter that falls within your jurisdiction as Chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. I'm speaking of the allegations of Dr. Beter about massive fraud involving United States gold supplies at Fort Knox. Looking at our crumbling economy, I'm inclined to believe Dr. Beter's charges that America has secretly become gold poor. Our economic problems today are exactly those which Dr. Beter has warned about for years, and yet I have never seen any effort by your committee to prove him wrong. I would like to believe your reputation as a defender of the public financial interest in Washington, so I hope that you will launch a full, complete public investigation of the alleged Fort Knox gold scandal without delay. If you will do so, I assure you of my strong personal support. As a starting point, let me suggest a piece of evidence which Dr. Beter says you were provided some 5 years ago. This was the written admission by the then Director of the United States Mint that a giant gold shipment from Fort Knox took place on January 20, 1965, even though the shipment was not shown on official Treasury listings. I anxiously await your reply. I am keeping a copy of this message and plan to show it with your reply to everyone I know." Unquote. What I have just suggested is just to get you started. By all means express your own thoughts in your own way as much as possible. But whatever you do, be sure to keep a file for your correspondence about this. When you get his reply, don't be discouraged or surprised if it turns out there will be an attack on my credibility or lip service or even silence. Just keep in mind that the Director of the United States Mint contradicted other Treasury documents about the missing shipment. That discrepancy has never been resolved, so don't let yourself be put off easily. If you receive a reply from Senator Proxmire, you may want to show both your letter and his to your friends. And to give them more background about it all, let them listen to AUDIO LETTER number 2 for July 1975. That tape contains a great deal about Fort Knox, and it's a good starting point. Beyond that, you may wish to follow up with more letters, always keeping a copy for your file. And in the months to come, if I learn that people are taking this first step, and it's only a first step, I plan to have more to say. But now it's up to you, my friends. It is time to give you my last-minute summary. In this audio letter, I've tried to call your attention to several things. One is the fact that the danger of all-out war is coming closer and closer to the surface. Once again, the Middle East is heating up as a possible fuse to set off nuclear war. War tensions are being excited primarily by the deliberate actions of Israel. The situation has become so critical that for only the 7th time in history, an emergency session of the United Nations has just been held to discuss it. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks here in the United States government are being hemmed in more and more by the secret Russian warfare of attrition. Secret military projects are still underway here in America, but the economic and industrial base that supports it all is being whittled away. A few days ago, Mount St. Helens, the most spectacular example yet of Russian geophysical warfare, erupted again, and as usual it came as a surprise to all the authorities. Only the day before, Washington State had started allowing tourists closer to the volcano because of its seeming stability, and the Russian weather war against America, which I revealed last February, is continuing. And Russia's geophysical warfare against America is still expanding. Just 2 days ago, 2 Russian cobalt bombs, which had been planted in deep caverns in the Midwest, were detonated. One was a short distance west of Cincinnati, Ohio. The other was under the northwest corner of the huge Fort Knox military reservation in Kentucky. The result was a strong earthquake called extremely rare, quote-unquote, by the United States Geological Survey. It registered 5.8 on the Richter scale and shook 12 states from Wisconsin to South Carolina. It may have been rare before the era of geophysical warfare, my friends, but now anything can happen. My friends, many people have been asking me the question, what can I do? I have given you step 1 of my answer, which deals with the Fort Knox gold scandal. It is something we can do, if we will. Our goal must be to get back the monetary gold reserves which have been stolen from us, to restore strength and confidence to the dollar, and to revive honor and trust in a newly reborn United States government. Because only in that way can we hope to remove the causes of war, which are now so imminent. Until next month, God willing, this is Dr. Beater. Thank you, and may God bless each and every one of you.
Except for one thing. The Zionist dream is for eventual world domination from Jerusalem, whereas the Bolsheviks want to control their former homeland of Russia and rule the world from there. But the Bolsheviks have largely lost the power they gained in Russia in 1917, and they are now using the United States as their main power base. The Bolshevik-controlled United States is virtually the lone sponsor of Israel. In return, Israel performs many favors for America's rulers, especially in military and covert spy matters. The United Nations emergency session, which just ended, amounted to a referendum by the world against Israel. For years, the Begin government of Israel has been pressing ahead in a relentless program of acts designed to inflame the anger of Israel's Arab neighbors, while protesting loudly that she only wants to be left alone in peace. Israel has been systematically doing the things that can only lead to war. And it is a war which can very quickly engulf the entire world. That is why a majority of the members of the United Nations were worried enough to petition for an emergency session. And after the 6-day debate was over, 112 nations lined up together against Israel. They declared Israel's settlements in the occupied Arab territories illegal and demanded that Israel start pouring out before November 15 of this year. Their common position was summed up by Guinea's United Nations ambassador in the words, "The process of war must come to an end." Israel's ambassador at the United Nations tried to paint the whole debate as a meaningless gesture, even though the United Nations created Israel in the first place. And following the Zionist lead, the Bolshevik-dominated major media here in America treated it as a non-event. Fleming completed a new James Bond novel only about once a year. If it had all been imagination, as many people believe, he would have been capable of producing a new book every few months, making himself far richer. But because his stories were all rooted in fact, secret fact, he did not dare speed up and run the risk of making a mistake. Ian Fleming had two purposes in writing his famous series of spy novels. One purpose, of course, was to earn a very comfortable living. But beyond that, he was also trying to subtly open the eyes of the reading public by the medium of fiction. Because of the Official Secrets Act, he could not publish the facts that he knew as fact, without modification. So he did what he felt was the next best thing, and that was to use his stories to open our minds to at least think in terms which were otherwise hidden from us. Fleming truly believed that this was something which somehow had to be done, because knowing what he knew, he was not an optimistic man. More than 3 decades ago, he could see that the public was beginning to be left behind by secret new weapons, new technologies, and new techniques to enslave us all. A public awakening was the only hope he could see to prevent eventual disaster. And so, beginning in the early 50s, Fleming started writing exciting fiction in order to hint at secret facts. His plan was fictionalized to open eyes. By the early 60s, the one-man campaign of Ian Fleming was starting to gather steam. His fictional hero, James Bond, started gaining popularity in ever wider circles. And even though his exploits were understood to be fiction, people were beginning to think of possibilities which they had never seen before. James Bond movies were in the works.
Hello, my friends. This is Dr. Beater. Today is July 30, 1980, and this is my audio letter number 56. Yesterday, an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly came to an end. It was treated as a non-event by the controlled major media of the United States, and many Americans have paid little attention. But it was only the 7th emergency session in the 35-year history of the United Nations. My friends, the stakes involve Nuclear War I. The Bolsheviks who now control the United States government are determined to bring about nuclear war with Russia one way or another. But their most preferred path to war lies through the Middle East. I first gave details about this nearly 5 years ago in AUDIO LETTER No. 6. Since then, there have been continual revisions and updates of the planning for war by way of the Middle East. I've kept my listeners abreast of these developments in later AUDIO letters, especially numbers 22, 28, 37, and 46. Ever since late 1977, the Middle East war plan has grown to include Iran as a central factor, because the main military strategy of the controlled United States government is now a first strike strategy, and Iran, nestled against Russia's underbelly, is a tempting base for attack against Russia. But the preferred initial focus of a Middle East war would not be Iran, but Israel. In AUDIO LETTER 50, I reviewed the common roots of the Zionists who control Israel and the Bolsheviks who now control America. They always work together, hand in glove, because they are derived from the same source. That ancient source was the misnamed Kingdom of the Jews, the Khazar Kingdom, which existed 1,000 years ago in what is now southern Russia. The Bolsheviks and Zionists are identical in their goals and tactics. The fact is, my friends, that Israeli actions are fast bringing the Middle East to the threshold of war. War fever is rising, and it is being reflected by the thermometer of war, the price of gold. Last January 21, 1980, gold traded at an all-time high of $875 per ounce. And as I revealed that month in AUDIO LETTER 53, a secret nuclear first strike operation was then being attempted against Russia. It failed, and gold prices dropped off for several months. But now, war danger is rising again. The Bolsheviks here are becoming increasingly desperate in their war plans against Russia. If we as a people are ever going to act to save ourselves from final ruin, now is the time we must begin. The stakes are life and death, peace or war. But the key to our own effective action is not military. It lies with the thermometer of war, gold. My three special topics this month are: topic number 1, Ian Fleming and the Fort Knox gold scandal. Topic number 2, narrowing options in the Bolshevik plan for nuclear war. And topic number 3, step 1 in what you can do. Topic number 1. Not many years ago, millions were fascinated by the fictional exploits of an imaginary British spy. His name was James Bond, and he was the creation of the late British author Ian Fleming. It was Fleming more than anyone else who created the image of the modern super spy. All the Fleming spy stories had two major characteristics in common that made them stand out. For one thing, every story was about a world-shaking situation which was kept secret from the public. The other common ingredient was always a dazzling display of secret high technologies of every description, things unknown to the public. These two unique features of his stories eventually catapulted Ian Fleming into worldwide fame. He was the undisputed leader in his field. As always happens, many others tried to copy him, and spy stories were all around us in the late 60s. But he always remained one of a kind. Try as they might, none of his imitators could ever match his work. It was as though he had a secret advantage, a secret weapon of his own. And my friends, he did. In writing his stories, Ian Fleming was drawing upon his own secret weapon. That weapon was knowledge. Fleming had been a high-ranking officer of Britain's crack intelligence agency called MI5. It was the British who practically invented and perfected the modern concept of intelligence. And to this day, British intelligence remains the equal of any in the world. When Fleming left Her Majesty's Secret Service to become a writer,
he was severely limited in what he could publish. He was bound by the restrictions of the British Official Secrets Act. Under that act, Fleming would have been liable for punishment for revealing any official secret without authorization. And so, Ian Fleming, the former British intelligence officer, became what is known as a fictionalizer. That is, he started with factual knowledge but rearranged and modified it in order to create startling stories of fiction. He was always extremely careful about how he did this. He always knew that he was skirting the fringes of the Official Secrets Act. He could not afford to make a mistake because it would have meant prison for him and possible forfeiture of pension rights. And so he always altered every situation, every secret technology, and every personality enough to avoid revealing actual secrets. It was a long and meticulous process both to protect himself and to make each final story readable. For that reason,